Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow it's Friday. We are beginning a new book of the Torah, Parashat Shemot, the book of Exodus in English. And one of the great questions that are discussed in our commentaries and our sages has been the million-dollar question: is the reason why does Israel have to go through the terrible exile of Egypt? I mean, why couldn't it be different? The million-dollar question. Why do we have to go through suffering? But in reality, there are huge volumes of writings on this one topic of what was the reason behind our exile in itself. But I think this topic takes us back to the great question that we're asking ourselves: is why are there very difficult things that people have to go through in life, on an individual scale, of course, and on a national scale. Here we have a whole nation of Israel, because I don't know if there's any example like Israel. Of course there isn't, in the entire world of the things that we've been through as a people. And the way we were formed as a nation, most nations are formed when there's a group of people coming, and they set shore to a land, and they begin to slowly develop their land. But Israel is a different situation, where our nation was formed like a creation. And we came out of the womb of Egypt, right? Israel had to go through this difficult suffering. As we know, it's brought down in the book of Bereshit, Genesis, when Abraham asked the question, how can I know, how do I know that we'll inherit, the land? And God right away brings him through the covenant of the halves, and he says, you should know that your children will be enslaved for 400 years. So we see already this was something that was well defined in history, the necessity to go through a 400-year slavery in Egypt. But putting all that aside, there are, of course, details that go on later, how it happens, the technical going down, Joseph was sold, and all that kind of thing. But in reality, it was something that seems to be predestined, and that's itself is a question, what about our free will and all that? But there is something we see about the nation of Israel, that it has to go through this going down to Egypt, and that's really the direction of many great giants in the esoteric teachings of Torah. Like the Maharal of Prague, for example, is very well known in his book, Gvorot Hashem, the book of Might of God, where he talks about how the process of going down to Egypt was a necessity, as a cleansing process of Israel. It wasn't a punishment. There are those who explain it as a punishment. It wasn't a punishment. Israel needs as a nation to go through this course. It's like you want to go to a course that sifts out the men from the boys, and Israel had to go through this difficult cleansing process in order to be who we are, to reveal who we are as a people. And that is the explanation of the Maharal, of course, and other great Kabbalists explain in that direction, that we have to cleanse ourselves. We have to gather the sparks. Israel has to ready itself to be who it is, to be the people they are. And that had to be done through the process of separating out in the darkest place on earth, the Egyptian darkness, which is full of uncleanliness and all the dark side, all the bad things of that there are in the world. And Israel is the light, has to come out of that darkness, and it was a necessity. I think if you look very well in the Tanakh, in the Torah, we see the story of Abraham. Abraham was a mini Egypt when Abraham had to go down, or chose to go down to Egypt because of the famine in the land. By the way, Nachmanides actually brings that down as a reason for exile, because Abraham chose to go down instead of dealing with the difficulties. But I'm not going now into the direction of Nachmanides. But Abraham goes down to Egypt. When he goes down to Egypt, obviously we all know that it was like a mini Egypt slavery in a way. Why? Because what happened in Egypt, I'm saying not slavery for Abraham, but his wife was taken away, and then the Paro was punished with getting all kinds of pitzaim, all kinds of wounds, whatever it was. He was with a plague. He was struck with, And that was like the plagues in Egypt. So it was like a mini going down to Egypt story, and then eventually he comes out with being blessed, and his wife comes out. He goes and eventually goes back to the land, of course, with wealth. So it's sort of Israel going down to Egypt, the Egyptians getting stricken with all kinds of plagues, and then coming out. Right, it was exact microcosm of this story that takes place to the nation later on, and that's what Abraham goes through. And then the same story happens on a national scale of all of Israel, going through that cleansing process and coming out. We see later on, if we look forward in history, I think the Holocaust is so clear that was like another leaving Egypt, being enslaved by the Germans and tormented and murdered, and the destruction that we went through as a nation within Nazi Germany, and to come out of that terrible situation, to meet again the state of Israel, forming the state of Israel again, the rebirth of Israel. That was exactly the same process that we went through in Egypt. So we see the nation of Israel has to go through these trials and tribulations, but in reality it's part of our inner essence of who we are, that it clarifies who we are as a nation. It gives us the ability, the strength to overcome any obstacle throughout history, and we're an everlasting nation, a nation that has proven itself to be literally a nation of eternity. It's impossible to eliminate the people of Israel in the world, and we see that nations have come and gone, and Israel remains steadfast in who it is as a nation. This is part of who we are, of being a light to the nations of the world. So that, again, there's just a touch upon that thing, that the reason of why we had to go through this cleansing process of going down to Egypt. But again, this topic itself, you could look it up, and there are many, many sources that give many reasons why, or different reasons. But in reality, this is really the summary of all the reasons that it's something that we have to go through. We don't have a choice. Here we have no free will. It's something that we need to do. It's part of the process that God already reveals to Abraham. We have to go through this process. I think I'd like to take this another step forward. If we look at this week's portion, where Moshe Rabbeinu, the future leader of Israel, is being slowly taught and slowly revealing his greatness, who he is, to be the leader of Israel. The whole process is developing slowly. And Moshe Rabbeinu, his first challenge, we see interesting challenges that actually lead up to the vision or the great event that takes place of the burning bush, as we're all familiar with. The first real appearance of Moshe Rabbeinu is now experiencing a divine revelation. But what leads up to it is three interesting events. Event number one, as we see that Moshe Rabbeinu, while in Egypt, right, he sees an Egyptian striking one of his brothers, and right away Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the call and strikes the Egyptian and places him in the sand, as we all know, which later on leads to him having to run away. But here, again, that devotion, that personal self-sacrifice that he has is being revealed. Incident number two, we see Moshe Rabbeinu sees two people fighting. Here, it's not an Egyptian, a Gentile against one of his brothers, but here it is two Jews that are fighting, two of his brothers that are fighting with one another. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to them, "Why are you fighting with one another?" And they say, "Who made you boss?" Whatever it is, right? Are you going to kill us like you did to the Egyptian? But here we see Moshe Rabbeinu attempted to solve the issue of brothers with teaching them. Right? Again, here he had a different approach to a clash between brothers. Here it was to talk and to educate, to try to teach. In the case of the Egyptian, a Gentile Egyptian that wanted to kill, that struck with his brothers here, Moshe Rabbeinu saw there was no way to give any reproof by word. It was only to strike that Egyptian, and that was what he saw, what he had to do. Here he's behaving differently. The third interesting way of Moshe Rabbeinu's behavior is when he gets to the situation of a clash at the well between the shepherds. And here again, it's between Gentile and Gentile. He's coming to the land of Midian, and they're having a fight over the water, right? But what does Moshe Rabbeinu do? There was no he didn't see any reason to strike, any reason to do other than just save those who were in trouble. The daughters of Jethro. There he just acted on. The words wouldn't help. Nothing would help but just to chase them away and help those who needed help. Interesting, 3 different approaches of Moshe Rabbeinu over there. But anyway, here we see how Moshe Rabbeinu is developing his inner potential, who he is, personality, developing who he really is coming out. The Torah is revealing us little bits and pieces of who this great personality is, who is going to be the leader of Israel, that is going to come and lead Israel out of Egypt and all this, the great prophet of all time. And that was really 3 interesting I would say, events that took place to reveal who he is, how he's perfectly exact in how he deals with in situations. One situation warrants this kind of action. Here it warrants different action. He's very exact in how he acts on different things. And here comes the big one, the vision, the whole event where the burning bush. And here I want to connect it to the opening of what we spoke about, of the reasons of exile. Why do we have to go down to Egypt? Moshe Rabbeinu, this is fascinating. I would like to show some of the midrashic interpretation of this Sinai. And we'll begin by reading the words of the Midrash. Right, I'll just read some of the words. The Midrash opens up and it says, Vayera malach Hashem elav. Right, we know that the angel appeared to Moshe Rabbeinu in the burning bush, right, in the Labat Esh, and the bush had a very, very unusual phenomenon. The bush was burning, but it did not. There was fire within the bush, but it was being devoured. It wasn't being eaten up. The Midrash opens up in Vayikar Rabbah with an interesting statement. It says, Ani yeshena v'li bi'er. I am asleep, but my heart is awake. What does that mean? I'm asleep and my heart is awake. Ani yeshena. I'd like to develop that statement. That statement is from the Song of Songs. The Midrash says, Ani yeshena min mitzvot. I'm sleeping from the mitzvot. Mitzvot refer to the commandments. V'li bi'er la'asotan. But my heart is awake to do them. In reality, externally, you could say, we're sleeping. We're not doing what we would like to do because of the situation we're in. But our hearts are really connected in a deep situation. Deep down, our hearts are really connected over there. The Midrash is talking about a very powerful situation where the inner essence of who we are as a people, as we said, has to become revealed in Egypt, right? But we're asleep. We've been asleep for the hundreds of years of exile, the hundreds of years of being torture and being tortured and killed and at the hands of the enslaved by the Egyptians. So in one way, we are asleep. We are asleep now because when we're asleep, you're sort of not connected, right? On one way, we're sort of not aware of what's going on. We're not aware of the divine plan. All we see in front of us is the terrible atrocities that are taking place in Egypt to Israel. But on the other hand, our hearts are awake. There's an inner spiritual, our souls are connected deep down. And this is really what the Midrash is telling us. It goes on to say that Imo Anochi B'tzar, with Israel, I am there in their difficult time. I'd like to give just an example. If we look, we all know, as parents, parents and grandparents, we see how the innocent child is playing. Just picture a little toddler playing with on the floor and enjoying himself. But of course, right nearby are the parents or the grandparents watching over to make sure that child is not going to do something that can endanger himself. So very quickly, if the child picks up something that should have picked up and God forbid putting it in his mouth and swallowing it, got to be careful to stop that child from God forbid endangering himself. Always watching, shouldn't get to the door, get to the staircase. You're always very careful not to allow the child to get into danger. So you're watching from afar, but very, very close. And the child is not aware. The child is like sleeping. He's not aware of what's going around him. But with the inner that inner essence we spoke about, the parents who are connected with that soul of that child, love that child so much, the grandparents, the family, those who are watching over the child, is very, very careful to watch over every step he makes. And this concept is really what is going on here. What the revelation of the burning bush is revealing is that God is saying, I am with you. The Midrash goes on to say, Imo anochi b'tzai, I am with you in your misfortune. God is with us. During the exile, the darkest times of exile, all these terrible things going on, and we're being persecuted and suffering. At the hands of the Egyptians, or the hands of, in Nazi Germany, the difficult things Israel went through. We have to always realize that God is saying, I am with you in your misfortune. To realize that He is with us. We may feel like we're sleeping, we don't see it, but in an inner sense, God is behind the scenes. We have to realize this. Everything we go through, there's a divine message, an appointment behind it. We have to be so careful to realize that. And it goes on to say, the Midrash, Vatal Shavatam El Elohim, they're yelling out, they're crying, went all the way up to the heavens, to God. And it goes on to say, God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, have יודע ממקום שאני מדבר עמך מתוך הקוצים כביכול אני שותף בצרה. God was trying to tell Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to be aware that I am aware of your pain, and I'm in pain just like you're all in pain. And that is why I'm talking to you all through what? I am talking to you through this bush. What was this sneh? What was this bush all about? This bush was a thorny bush. A bush of thorns, a desert plant that represents and reflects that God is saying why God chose. He could have chosen many other kind of trees, but he chose this particular tree, this bush, this sneh bush, because it's very thorny and dry, and represents the difficulty. The thorns represent being tormented, being persecuted, being abused, enslaved. And God is saying, I am therefore a partner in your difficulty, showing us, revealing to us that He is there in our times of sorrow. God is really behind the scenes and with us. We see that the first mifgash, the first meeting between God and Moshe Rabbeinu finally has this revelation after proving who he was, as I mentioned before, his righteousness, which the Torah reveals. It gives little bits and pieces of who this individual was. But the first meeting was, God was teaching him a lesson of the nation. It's no longer individuals, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we all know, still individuals. Here we're talking about a national scale, a nation. Moshe Rabbeinu is going to be a leader of this nation of Israel. And God is saying, in order to be a leader of the nation, we have to realize, first and foremost, that God is always with His people. Here, way down in Egypt, God came down with us to Egypt, as it says. He came down to exile to be with us. And we have to realize that all the most difficult, darkest situations in the world, Hashem is with us behind the scenes. And this is really what Moshe Rabbeinu is being taught by God within the thorns of the thorn bush, with this sneh and the fire burning. God is teaching Moshe Rabbeinu a lesson about the nation of Israel being cleansed in Egypt. And in a very important lesson, he goes on to say in the Midrash is that the bush is not being devoured. So Midrash goes along to tell us that why is the bush being devoured? That teaches that Israel will never be devoured. That although we're going to go through a lot of difficulties and throughout history, but our nation is indestructible. So the burning of the bush, on one hand, the fire represents again the difficulties, the struggle that we have. But on the other hand, we will not be devoured. Our essence is so powerful, strong, will be revealed. So the concept of being asleep, but your heart being awake, the heart is our soul, is our connection to Hashem. Deep down, Israel, in our inner essence, we know that God is with us. We have to reveal that connection. And that is what Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader, is coming. God is revealing to him that I am with you in your trouble. I am within this bush, just like this bush now. This desert plant that seems like the most furthest thing away from godliness. It's a plant but God fills up the entire universe. God is everywhere. And I'm here with you. I'm revealing to you through this tree that I am with you in the most darkest of times, and I will take you out. And from here, of course, God, reveals the message to Moshe Rabbeinu that you will be, to take the people out of Israel. You're going to be the leader, the prophet who's going to lead the people out of Israel. Moshe Rabbeinu, another revelation of his greatness, it says he turns away to labit, to look at Hashem. He doesn't want to glaze. Now, of course, we're not talking about a physical looking at God, because it's something, obviously, there's no way possible that we can physically see the God of the universe. It's something in a much higher realm, a spiritual realm, that we're connecting. Moshe Rabbeinu was connecting, but he felt he wasn't ready to jump to that level of being able to connect at this high level. So he turned away. And here we see, as he's growing as a leader, God is allowing, he's growing together with the people of Israel in Egypt. It's developing. It's a process. He's not there yet on that high level of spirituality, the highest level which we will reach later on, which we call the Aspaklaria Mira. Moshe Rabbeinu knows his place, how important it is to know your place, to know who you are and to where you stand, and not to jump beyond your level before it's time. It's very, very important for that. As the leader of Israel, Moshe Rabbeinu represents all these qualities. His love and kindness, his caring, his being a teacher, and knowing his place is so important to be the leader and the future prophet for Israel. And here again, within the bush, as I mentioned before, God is revealing to us the necessity to realize that Hashem will always be there for us, even the most darkest times of history. And if you say, why do we have to go through these terrible things? Sometimes we don't know exactly why all the things have to happen, but we have to understand that this is part of the process of cleansing us and forming the nation, strengthening us and making us who we are, to fulfill our role as being a light to the nations. This Israel has to go through these hard times. It will come out with flying colors. It will enter the land of Israel after receiving Torah and build a beautiful country, a beautiful kingdom of Hashem, a temple in the land where we can reach out to the nations. Although we went through other exiles only because of more new additional cleansings were necessary. But Israel is indestructible, as we said, and we will survive all these difficult situations. And now we're back for the third time. We're going to be building our third temple. We are promised that we'll no longer leave our land, and we will rise to our important destiny of being a light to the nations, God willing. And we will see very soon, God willing, how the events will lead to what the prophets talk about, our third temple, and to all the important functions the nation of Israel has in the world, which will bring about the redemption for the entire world peace, and a blessing to all of humanity through Am Yisrael, through the nation of Israel. Shabbat Shalom, Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot v'Nechamot.